Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our viewers live around the world. Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome to 60 Minutes of Unscripted .NET Entertainment. As doctors of .NET, we prescribe healthy choices in .NET, and I'm super excited to welcome our guest today. But before I do, I'm your host, David Pine. With me, we've got Cam Soper and Scott Addy, and we've got the one, the only Jason Bock. Jason, say hello.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well for a Tuesday.
One question for you, David. You say unscripted, but it looked to me like you were reading from a script there.
Totally reading from a script. That's the only part that's scripted. So partially.
So
it's
I was going to say
interpretive.
We should change that to mostly unscripted.
Partially freestyled. So, but Jason,
I got to ask you real quick, David, and Scott, because you both live in Wisconsin, where I did come from. Is it snowing there? Because right now on my window, we are getting snow in Minnesota.
No snow right now.
Okay.
Snow the last 3 days here, but not today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Jason.
Sure. My name is Jason Bock. I'm a developer advocate for Quicken Loans. I just have been there for about 7 months now. For the majority of my career, I was a consultant. In fact, I worked for a couple of consulting companies when I lived in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee, and then eventually moved up to Minnesota, where I live right now. I'm a Microsoft MVP, been that now for, I got the award behind me, so I was looking at it, I'm trying to do the math off the top of my head. It's like 12 or 14 years or something like that. I've been doing a lot. Yeah, it's been a stretch, but it's also great. I really very appreciative that I have that, and do a lot of speaking, a lot of writing, a lot of community work. Also in the Twin Cities area, I'm part of the team that does the Twin Cities Code Camp, which Scott and also you, David, you both presented there. So thank you for that. So that's a little bit about myself.
Awesome. Should we jump into the checkup right away?
Let's do a checkup.
Let's do it. I'm going to share my screen here. So for today's checkup, we actually have a special non-docs platform edition, and we're going to highlight the Roslyn repository, specifically relevant to today's topic. So Roslyn is the C# compiler platform. It's open source, and within that, we have a new feature that was recently announced that is source generators, and there's actually a cookbook. So the cookbook is kind of taking parts, of the full design document, which is available here. But there's this kind of proposal about how to go about utilizing source generators. And Jason's going to have in our hallway track a lot of actual code examples of this and some real world examples. And this is more kind of ideas and talks about some of the things that are out of scope. There's various limitations that they call attention to, things that they explicitly don't want you to do. There's anti-patterns, but it talks about some of the various conventions and how to go about utilizing source generators. So if you have this
I love that in the conventions that they have a to-do.
Yeah, very much a README type file in a repository, right? This is bare bones. It's not, I don't think we even have documents on source generators yet. And that's something we should probably add if we don't already. But yeah, as a point of, contention, this is where you would want to focus, right? This is as close as you can get to, Roslyn, besides the docs, because this is within their repository. This is what the developers themselves put together. So their cookbook is, kind of their intent for this feature, specified here. So there's a user scenario where as a generator author, you want to be able to add a type to the compilation that you can reference from your user's code. So imagine that you have a class and you have this user method. So what you would do is for your generated stuff, you would just basically call into it, even though it's not yet written. And then you would have a generator, it's decorated with this attribute, and it's an implementation of iSource generator. And then on execute, you would define that methodology that you had exposed back there. And I have not actually played with this. So I'm very, very new to this. I'm going to hopefully have some perspectives, much like our viewers who are probably anxiously awaiting the hallway track where we'll uncover, real world scenarios for this. But I am curious, and I did want to ask you kind of preemptively and selfishly, Jason, is this something that you're utilizing right now in production? Do you have any code out there that's actually using this?
So production as to my employer, no. Being a developer advocate, I'm not on a train or a team and pushing out code out to production. But the examples I'm going to show, all that stuff's out on NuGet. So sure, same thing.
NuGet is as production as it gets. I mean,
exactly.
Left pad and npm, that's production, right?
Exactly.
Now, before we hop over into the hallway track, where Jason is going to educate us on what we're looking at here, I just want to call out that this documentation, I feel like this documentation, like they literally just copied and pasted their user stories from whatever agile planning tool they use, which is all right. I mean, that's totally acceptable. It's user actually, scenario, I think, kind of a clever way to do documentation.
Example. Yeah, right. It's very sequential, right? And then here's your story, here's your scenario, here's the solution, here's sample source code, and then it continues on, right? This is actually a pretty lengthy cookbook. It talks about a lot of the different semantics, getting properties of the compilation context and all of the different parts here. So it's pretty well done, and this is, I would assume, a great starting point for anyone who's really curious and wants to dive in and start exploring this.
Yeah, actually, David, real quick. Do I post to the comments section and then that's going to show up to everybody, or just a private chat? Because I have a gist of a bunch of links that people can also look at. This was one of them. So
yeah, if you do private chat, then we can share it on comments.
Okay. There you
and
go.
I just wanted to call attention to the fact that you said, did you say gist?
Don't say it.
Said guest.
Oh God, are we going to get into a fight about pronouncing stuff?
I think this is a gist, but yeah, I know
Gist,
what you.
gist,
I know what you meant. All right, cool. We'll let's share that real quick here in the comments if it hasn't been already. Hi friends, we got some friends saying hello from Egypt, hello from Dubai. Awesome. Well, let's jump into. Hey, Chris is on. Hi from Pakistan, India, Poland. Lots of friends from around the world. So happy for you to be here with us today. Let's do the hallway track. Let's get into it.
All right.
So the hallway track is our pseudo open circle. Imagine a hallway track at an actual developer conference. This is where we invite our friends to engage, ask questions to our guests today. But Jason's going to be sharing with us some actual source code for source generators with C#. Let's check it out.
All right, that is definitely the intent. So I have a whole new setup, and one of the things I do not have that's on my wish list is another monitor. So I'm going to ask, can you see the code? Can you see all the things? Is that all being shared right now?
Yeah,
cool.
I can see. Should guess, is that Zoom okay? Is that font size big enough, or should we go? Let's wait to see if anyone chimes in. When this is
bump it a little bit.
Yeah, we'll bump it a little bit. Let's bring some of that text out to the further right. We got some white space there on the right.
I think we usually do 120% in Visual Studio.
Mastercraft says it looks good on my 24-inch.
All right. Okay. We'll stick with this. This is 16 point, and
okay.
And hopefully
awesome.
It works really well. All right. So speaking of having everything prepared, I actually have a whole bunch of notes here just so I can make sure I get through stuff. But as I've been forewarned, we might go a little bit off track a little bit. But that's awesome. That's actually, I plan for that as a speaker, that you sometimes get questions or discussion, and that's totally fine. In fact, I'd actually look forward to that. So it was good, David, that you actually used the URL, that cookbook, because it's good to at least know what source generators are. I want to make clear that it is hopefully not automating ourselves out of a job. I saw you put that in as a tagline to the stream. I was like,
we're trying to get clickbait. That's what our responsibility is, to get people to click, and then when they come here, we'll say source generators aren't that. But thank you for following.
Yes, it's not hopefully to automate ourselves out of a job, but it is one of the cool things is to automate some code stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis. So, as David was talking before with source generators, ultimately the one sentence tagline is, it's a way for you to generate code at compilation time. That's the takeaway. Okay, so the way that you generate this code can be done in a couple of ways. Typically, you're going to look at code that currently exists in your project. You can also look at additional files. I'm not going to cover that in my demos, but that's also another thing that you can do. If you have an additional file in your project, you'll actually be able to read that and do whatever you want with it to generate more code. Okay. One of the limitations of it right now is you can't change code that is currently there. So you can't go into a method body and suddenly start adding pieces of code to the method body, or removing things, or taking methods away in classes. If you're targeting a partial class, arguably you can add to it with a source generator, but keep in mind that really what you're doing is it's purely additive. You're not changing anything that's currently there, okay? But that may sound like a little bit of a restriction, and it is, but there's a lot of cool things that you can do with source generators. Hopefully I'll show a couple things here, and the links that I have in the gist link that I put out there, you can take a look at a whole bunch of stuff later. There are a lot of cool things that people are doing with this. It's really, really fun. Okay. And before I show the demos, there's a couple of things I want to talk about that are advantages that I think are really something to keep in mind with source generators. There is that automation aspect. If you think about iNotify property change, which there actually is an example from Microsoft on their site, where they automatically generate all the boilerplate code that you do with iNotify property change. So you don't have to write that yourself. It's typically not that hard. It's fairly straightforward, but it's repetitive. You do that over and over again. And with source generators, you can do something where you can say, this stuff that I write all the time, I can just go off and have the source generator do that for me, and then I don't have to think about it. Okay. Another one is performance. If you've ever done things where you want to do some generalized solution and you're going to end up using reflection or expression trees or even IL generation, that's cool stuff. But especially with reflection, there is a little bit of a performance hit. And again, that varies on what you're doing and how many times you do it. But it's because at runtime, it has to kind of figure all this stuff out on the fly. And if you think of things like serializers, for example, that's a big one, where you have an object, you're trying to figure out at runtime, well, what are all the things I have to serialize? Whereas with the source generator, you could say, this is exactly what I need to do. This is the exact path I need to go down. And so you can potentially and probably get gains in decreased memory usage and faster code. Okay? So those are the two things that I think are really beneficial about source generators. So I've got a couple of examples here. And the first one, I'm going to spend a little bit more time actually showing the mechanics of how this actually works. And then the other two, I'm just going to demo them to show you where else you can go with source generators. The actual underlying implementation code gets pretty hairy, but this one is fairly straightforward. And so I think it's a good one to start with. Okay. And this is called inline mapping. This is a NuGet package that I created that's kind of like AutoMapper, which I think a lot of .NET developers know about. It's this NuGet package that you can say, I've got this source object, I got this destination object. They have properties that are very similar, so I want to take the stuff from the source and I want to put it into the destination and give me back a new destination object. Okay, AutoMapper does that rather well, and I've seen some people take it to an extreme that should have probably never gone there in the first place. But that's not what this demo is going to do. It's keeping the simple case of take a source and go to a destination. But what I wanted to do with this example is say, could I do this with a source generator? Okay, so if you see the code here, and I have to say with C#9, I'm loving top level statements, with a program file. This is so much better than having to type program in main. Oh,
it's nice to hear someone say that. I hear a lot of folks struggling to find a good use case for that. And
Yeah,
it sounds like you found one here.
Well, I've used
Yeah.
it in some documentation, and I've actually had people reach out to me and go, "This documentation has a sample that's wrong. How does this even compile?"
Yeah, it's different. It's definitely got a different feel. And so at first it's like, yeah, why did they even spend time doing this? But the more I use it, I don't know if it's, you just get beaten over the head with something too much and you finally go, okay, fine, it works. But no, this one is, I like it. I actually find this to be a nice little feature. And more of these little things to get rid of all that code. So this first one is going to take a source object. And if I show you what that is, you see we have a source here that just says 3 properties. We also have a map to attribute on it that says what I'm going to map to. Okay, but that's it. It just says these 3 properties. And then the destination has 3 properties that match along with one that doesn't exist on the source. Okay, so go back up here. We set up our source up. Yeah.
Real quick, what's the namespace on that map to attribute? Where did that map to attribute come from?
I will show that in a moment. Okay?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of the demo.
I will definitely go there. Okay. So we have our source here, and then I just print out what the contents are of the source. But now I got this map to destination method, and you see that it's an extension method. I will dive into it in just a bit, but that doesn't exist on the class itself. Okay. So I got this map, and then I got this destination class or object that I'm going to print out. So let me just run my console app here so we can actually see what the results are going to look like. And they should have the same values, okay, as they do, okay? But the reason over here it doesn't have anything in it.
That's why it's like a comma empty. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so how does all of this work? Where does this, like you said, where does that map to attribute come from? And if I hover over it, you'll see that if I actually have 12 into it, we do the from metadata, it's coming from this inline mapping package that I created, okay? So I'm gonna jump into the code now that actually does the source generator, okay? So we can see a little bit about, take what David was showing from that cookbook and go a little bit farther to see what this does, okay? So this is just, I have a couple projects in here, but the inline mapping one is the main one. And as you saw before, you inherit from iSource generator and you mark your generator as a generator with that attribute, okay? And iSource generator has 2 methods that you have to implement. The execute right here, which I'll get back to in a moment. And then down here, initialize. You don't have to do anything in initialize, but what I've seen a lot of people do, and I do this a lot as well, is you can use initialize to essentially set up what's called a receiver. And that receiver really lets you do filtering. Because as David was mentioning, this is all in the compiler API. You've got syntax trees, you've got these rich syntax trees that tell you everything about what's in your code, where I just really want to focus on one particular thing. In this case, I want to know when a class has that map to attribute on it, okay? So I can set this receiver up to say, just tell me when you find instances of this thing occurring in code. I'll kind of mark it as a candidate, and then when I actually have to generate code, then I'll dive a little deeper, okay? So this map to receiver just inherits from this syntax receiver class. And then what I do is I'm just told to visit a syntax node, and then I have to look at it and say, is it something I want to do? So in this case, I look to say, did you give me a type declaration? I'm going to look through all the attributes. And if the name of that attribute has what I'm looking for, I'll mark it as a candidate. It may not actually be the thing I'm looking for, but this is probably a good indicator of something I want to look at. Maybe you want to look at method invocations. Maybe you want to look at class declarations. There's all these different things that you can look at. And if you're in Visual Studio, there's a tool I highly recommend that you install, like the compiler SDK, the compiler API SDK. There is a window that you actually get when you do this. It's called the syntax visualizer. I think there's also something for VS Code as well. I'm not sure. But this tool is really, really helpful, because if you say, hey, I want to look at something like, if I go back to, well, here, if I click on add, you'll notice that now the syntax visualizer shows me everything that's in that tree. So it's on the identifier token, but if I come up, you can see, if I go to invocation expression there, it's now highlighting that in my code editor, okay? So this is what's nice about source generators. I can just write a piece of C# code in the code editor, open up the visualizer and go, what am I actually trying to target? And so this gives, if you're not familiar with the compiler API, this is a nice tool to have to give you kind of a guided tour as to where you may want to end up going, okay? So I'm going to get some candidates, go back to my generator here, and on the execute method here, I'm going to go through all those candidates, and yeah, there's going to be a fair amount of code here, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but essentially what I want to do is go through those candidates and see if they are the map to attribute that I define in my project or in this package. And if they are, then I'm going to start looking at that attribute, looking at the class that it's on and say, what does the source look like? What does the destination look like? Find properties that map, and then create a piece of text. And that's what you really need to have come out of your generator is text. Because, and in fact, if you hover over here, you can see I have a source text coming out. But really what you're doing is creating a bunch of C# code as a string. You're going to put it in a source text, and then you're going to tell the context, yeah, I created something, so I can add that to my source.
So I'm going to, if you don't mind, Jason, I'm going to
Sure,
stop
go
you
ahead.
right there. I've got this question that's burning in my mind. You mentioned generate C# code with source generators. In the past, I would say years ago, I used T4 templates to generate code. One of the strengths of T4 templates for me personally was I wasn't restricted to just C# or VB code generation. I could also generate things like TypeScript for my ASP.NET application that I was working on. So I guess where I'm going with this question is, how do source generators compare to T4 templates? Is there still a place for T4?
Is there still a place for T4? I use T4 a little bit here and there in my career. T4 to me was always a separate tool. So, and yeah, people use them a lot to generate, especially way back in the day where you didn't have generics and you had to create type safe collections, okay? They were always, to me, something that was kind of a separate tool in and of itself, whereas source generators are integrated within the compilation process itself. So that to me is the real big win with source generators. And the potential downfall that people have seen with source generators, it's not downfall, but kind of a disadvantage is, well, I have to create strings. So how do I actually create C# code as strings? That whereas T4 maybe had a little bit more formalism with the formatting of the template and what have you. That doesn't really exist, though there is, I think, a library called Scribian that allows you to do templating within C# itself. I actually just create strings. That's what I do. So I have my code generated within a string, as you'll see in a moment. Again, you could actually use, there's a class in the compiler API called Syntax Factory, which you can use to generate a whole bunch of pieces that goes into a syntax tree, and then you essentially toString on that, and that gives you your code. However you want to do it, it's totally up to you. There's no one way to generate all that code, as long as you can get a string version of it to put in the source text, okay?
Okay, thank you. And while I have your attention, we probably should get to some of these questions we're seeing in chat here.
Okay.
I'll just pick the first one I see, and we'll hopefully get to all of these. But here is the question. I'll put it up on the screen. Can I have a source generator in a project which I use in another project within the same solution?
Can I say that again?
So can I have a source generator in a project? So I think that the question is, can the source generator live in one particular project but be used in another project within the same solution?
Yes. I'm going to talk about testing and debugging in a moment. So yes, it does work. There's a little bit of it doesn't quite work as well, and I'll explain what I mean by that when I get to testing. But yeah, you can do it, and you really, with all this stuff, I package them all up as NuGet packages and then just distribute them that way. I find that's the easiest way to do that with source generators. But you can have a project like I have right here that contains the source generator and then reference it from another project. But again, you'll see what I mean in a moment about how that works. Okay. Is there any other question you want to cover, or should I continue on?
David, do you see anything else in the chat? I just took a real quick look.
There
I'm sure
was
there's
another
something.
one earlier on. Let's see here. So Vitali says, so how can he's got a two-part question. Where can you find examples in .NET 5? We'll provide links for that. And then how to place the generated file out of the current project, but by relative path. I think this is similar to the separate projects referencing another one that was generated. So I think that's covered.
Yeah, the first question is definitely covered. The second one, that might be, can I actually get the source code that's generated as a CS file? And in Visual Studio, it's not actually saved to disk, but there is an option in the CS proj file where you can say the source code that's generated, actually save that out as a CS file. Okay, so that is possible. All right, so in this generate mapping, again, I'm not going to dive into all the details here, but if I go to this mapping information and my mapping builder, which is really where I'm doing all the work, I actually use an indented text writer because I want the generated code to look a little nice. So I use something from the code down namespace, which I find a little funny, but it works. And so you can start seeing in here that I'm generating code like using system. I'm going to generate other using statements based on types that are in the source and destination that I'm going to need in that file. I'm going to start generating a partial static class here, this map to extensions. This is what's actually going to hold the extension method that I make. You can actually see here map to destination type name. That's where that name was coming from in the sample I was showing before. And then as I go through all the properties that I found that were mapped from the source to destination is I literally just write that map out, okay? And then I have all the indentation happening there. And at some point I finally come out of this and I have a piece of code. Well, what does this code actually look like? If I hop back to my example here with right here, I'll come back up. And map to destination, if I have 12 into that, that's what it looks like. Okay. So that's all generated from the source generator. And I want to do this too because I find this fun to see. If I put this over here, okay, and I come back down to my source and my destination, where I didn't have that reason property before, if I just plop that up there, notice that it pops up into the generated code as well. Because again, it picks up that, oh, something happened. So I'll need to do a remapping, and now I have reason remap as part of the mapping as well.
And I just want to call out, just in case some of our viewers have missed it, that UI hint in the generated code editor in Visual Studio that points out that it's auto-generated and can't be edited.
Yeah, exactly. Again, if I can put that switch in the CS proj file to say save them, I haven't found a real reason to do that, but you can do it. But here, even though that's auto-generated, here's a cool thing. I'm going to put a breakpoint there. Okay, I'm just going to close this. And I'm going to come back in here, and I'm just going to hit F5 this time. I'm actually going to run with the debugger attached. And if all goes well, of course it's not going to do it. Of course it's not going to do it. Let's actually do that. Oh, because I shut the file down. Let's actually do it from here. So I'll hit F5, and now I'll hit F11 to step into, and I can actually step into the generated code. Things that you may have used in the past that do things like IL weaving or assembly creation, that's all done with the intermediate language, you really don't get this. But because this is just C# code that's literally compiled into your assembly, if you use a tool like IL-SPY, for example, you'll see this class in this assembly. There's no difference. And because it gets compiled, it gets all the same benefits that you would from your other code, including debugging capabilities. So I can go in here, I can see self and my locals, I can drill down into that, do things from the immediate window that I would typically do. And if for some reason the generated code wasn't doing what you expect, you'd be able to debug it here and look and go, oh yeah, here's my mistake. And then go into your source generator and fix that. So I personally love this. I really like that I can actually go right into the generated code and see what it looks like and also debug it. Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it's really nice. Now the question that somebody asked about, can I reference essentially from another project, the source generator project? You can, but let me kind of show what I mean by that, because this ties into testing as well. So if I go over here to my Solution Explorer, you'll notice that I have a couple of test projects. One of them is just called tests. This is what I have as my quote unquote unit tests. And what I typically do in here is I just want to run, for example, if I go to the generator test, I just want to run and see, did I actually get some of the stuff that's actually generated? Okay, and you can do these kinds of tests. If I go down here, where I can get way down at the bottom, should have went to F12 here. Way down the bottom, you can actually host the compiler and do a compilation in your test, and then also have that compilation run all your generators. So then you can get the results of your generator within a unit test and then look at the results and say, does this have in there what I want it to have? Okay.
That takes a lot for my mind to process. With just
yeah, you got code that's being compiled that has the compiler within it. Yeah, it gets a little.
It's like the Matrix, or like
yeah.
So how do you test something like that? That's kind of where my mind's going.
So you'll notice here that in this case, what I'm doing, and this is just what I found by writing a couple of source generators, that what I want to do with these tests is just kind of see, do I get certain pieces of code, but I'm not looking at the entire structure. I'm just trying to see, did I not get diagnostics? Because you can create the diagnostics that show up in your error list in, for example, like Visual Studio, that say, hey, you did something wrong. So you can create those diagnostics as well. So in some cases, I'm saying this should have worked. I shouldn't have had any diagnostics. I should see that I have the destination method and so on, okay? But if I really want to see this be interactive, I also have this integration test thing up here. And so you'll see this kind of looks like what you saw in the other project where I have the actual map to destination extension method there, and I'm checking that the properties are actually what I expect it to be. The way that this is referenced, though, if I go into the CS project file, is it's a little different. I have it referenced with output item type equal analyzer. Okay, and this is important because you actually want Visual Studio to reference that other project from this project as essentially an analyzer. And then all the goodness of source generators will actually kick in and it will work. But there's a caveat here. If I go back into my inline mapping project and I have to change something in my source generator because it just doesn't work, I made something, I had an error in it or whatever, and so then I fix it, Visual Studio has still got that analyzer loaded and it won't unload it, even if I change it. So there's a little bit of a catch-22 here. If I don't have output item type there, then it's like any other project reference. If I change the stuff there, it will show up here. In this case, it gets the result from that project and essentially caches it. And I and other people have found that essentially what you have to do if you make a change is you have to shut down and start up again, which is not the most ideal thing in the world. That's why I have that first level, just that test project where I use the compiler and have it run my generator and drive it and then give me the text output, because then I can look at it and go, okay, that works or doesn't. And if something doesn't, if I make a change, it's a normal project reference and everything updates as you expect. Whereas in this case, I get all the nice and telesensy things and that works here, but I don't get updates. So then I have to refresh. And hopefully that changes in the future, please.
Well, there's something else here that caught my attention, Jason. This is a little bit off topic, but I'm sure others are wondering. So what led you to choose NUnit over something like XUnit or MS Test? Was there something specific to source generators that led you to that decision? No,
it's just a preference. I mean, all those test frameworks are, will get you what you want, which is to run tests. I just like NUnit, but XUnit is fine. So there's nothing specific to NUnit that you have to use for source generators.
Got it.
Just my personal preference. Okay. So you can have that reference there. Another way you can do it is actually I have a project here that references the NuGet package that I create for that project as like just through a file reference. If you go up to my solution items here, you'll see that I have a NuGet config and I say, use this directory that contains the NuGet package that's created on build and then reference it over here. Okay, so that's another way to do it. And so that's just the different ways to reference this from another project. Yeah. All right. We talked about testing. We talked about debugging. So that's essentially a high overview. Not necessarily high. We actually got kind of deep with source generators. But let me just go through 2 other examples. And if there are other questions, again, feel free to just say, hey, Jason, stop talking. We want to ask you a question. But let me go through a couple of other examples that I've created that use source generators. One of them is this thing called partially applied. At the end of last year, I was spending some time looking at Python just to get my head around it and learn some basics about it. And one of the things they talked about was partial function application. Yes, I heard was there a question or not?
No, I was just going to point
Okay.
out that, I was just going to point out that, there's this big, you had to scroll down to the second demo. I kind of feel like regions might have helped here.
Ooh, come on.
Cam, are you trying to start a war?
And regions. That's funny.
Also, Jason mentioned early on, source generators are an additive, so you technically couldn't create something that strips out the regions from all of Cam's code.
That is correct. Though I've written an analyzer with a code fix that will do that. That's
Nice.
somewhere out. Yeah.
There's also, while we're on the topic, things that don't matter. Matt Christensen actually created a Visual Studio extension that will remove regions. So,
Yeah. And then people have told me they're going to start a war where they're going to create a extension or whatever that's going to just add regions everybody's code.
Everywhere. Every line.
Mine is easier because it just looks for the region and end region and just nukes them. So yeah, I win. Anyway, so we could get into tabs versus spaces if we're going to go down this road, but we're not. We're going to move on. So this example it does partially applied functions in C#, which I've seen other people do with using funcs and actions. But I'm like, can I generate this? Can I just make this happen? And if you're wondering what a partially applied function is, it's essentially taking something like I have maths.add here, which I'm doing the British version because I don't want to collide with the math type in system. So I have a simple add method here. Well, what happens if I want to say I always want A to be 3? So I want to apply 3 to A, and then I want to get another function out that basically always has A equal to 3. Okay. So that's kind of what this is doing, this partially apply invocation here. I have a source generator that's going to look at what you pass into me here. And unlike what you saw with inline mapping, there is no partially applied type when you first do this. If that kind of blew your mind, I'm sorry. But what I actually do with my source generator is I look for, well, you're trying to invoke a method called apply on a type called partially. So what? It doesn't exist. I'm going to make it with my source generator. Okay. So in this case, what I do is I say, pass me in a function, and then pass in all the parameters that you want to partially apply. And then I want to increment by 3 because it's always going to be 3 plus whatever. So when I run this, you'll see that I should get 7 in the console app. And when it's done, we get 7. Okay. Now, what does partially apply actually look like? Because I have to have that source generator do something. Well, that's what it looks like. So it looks at the target method. It looks at the types of the thing you're passing in. It returns, in this case, a new func that's going to take 1 parameter and return an int. And just close over the A that you give it and use what C# already does for me. I just have this apply method generated out of thin air.
So wait a second. This is exactly, we were talking about this last week with Luis and F#. This was a missing C# feature that didn't exist. This concept of like applicative delegation and parameter passing throughout so wait a second. I got to look at this for a little bit now because this is still. So you partially apply a function which is taking 2 integers, returning an integer called method. You also have this other thing called A, and it's expressed as a new function which is B with the method applied to AB.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And the cool thing too about source generators is if you know funcs and actions, for the vast majority of things are going to work. But say, for example, you wanted to hurt people and make them call a method that had 20 parameters. not recommended. There's no func or action that represents that, but I can detect that and actually create delegates on the fly. And that's what partially apply does as well. It will create a delegate for those 20 parameters, and then you can use that as well.
I'm already in love with this. This is amazing. This is kudos. I tip my hat. We do have a question here, and
Sure.
I think you've already addressed it. Since this is dynamically generated source code here, we've got someone asking, how do you partially apply, with generic functions? And the fact of the matter is that was generic, right? It was a func.
Well, no, this maths.add isn't, but
what I was saying is,
okay.
It's generic in that you could change maths.add to something else, and the types are inferred and generated on the fly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that does work. It also works if you look at the repository and look at the tests for partially applied. If you have open generics, that's also works as well. If you have optional arguments that have default values, I'll emit a delegate in that case, and that will work as well. So yeah, whatever you do in C#, you can do. And to that point, I want to get through this last demo real quick. This is called Rocks. This is my own mocking framework because apparently MOQ and NSubstitute, they're fine. They're perfectly fine frameworks. But 5 years ago, I wanted to find another thing that I could use the compiler API for. So I wrote this thing that generates the mock type as C# code, but it was all done through reflection and whatnot. With source generators, now I'm not only able to use source generators to create the mocks, but I can actually create a whole API on top of the mock that hopefully looks a little bit better. So in this case, just to show you what I'm trying to get at, is I have a interface here that can return a customer, and then that's passed into this class on the constructor, and then its get method turns around and calls repositories get method. I mean, this is something that people do all the time. You inject dependencies, typically as interfaces, and then
it's like the decorator pattern, right?
Yeah, but then you want to write tests that you're not actually talking to the real thing.
Yep.
Some people like mocks, some people don't, but if you do and you use MLQ, great framework to do. So that's exactly what this is doing. But in this case with Rocks, it's all source code generated, and I can do something like this. For example, I want to create a rock. And so I want to set up expectations that I expect that my code under test is going to be, that the get method is going to be called with an ID value of 3. So look at what you can do now with source generators. If I do rock dot, and I actually do Alt X here just to show you the extension methods, I actually generate an instance extension method for all of the constructors in case you actually gave me a class rather than an interface. I'll generate methods. That's where I can set up all my methods and also all my properties, okay? So if I go to methods here, I can now do, I expect get to be called with a value equal to I, whatever ID is, 3. Or I could use arg.any is default, validate. I can set up a func to validate things. That's fine as well. I can also just say, I'm also expecting that it's going to return that customer object you see up at the top, okay? So then I get an instance of my mock. I'll pass that into customer retriever. I'll call get, and if everything works here, you'll see that I got that customer back, and my verify makes sure that everything was called as expected. If I made this a +1, I'm going to get an exception. Or at least it should give me an exception if it's, there we go. So it's telling me that, an expectation wasn't met, okay? So you'd use this in a testing framework, not in a console app per se. But if I F12 into the methods here, you're gonna see all the generated code that's needed for the Rocks library. And you don't have to look at this. You could just, let this sit there and not have to worry about it. But if you're curious, you're like, oh, this is the mock type that's actually created that implements get and makes sure that all the expectations are verified. And also, if you want to return a value, it will return that back for you. So you can do whatever you want to do in C#, you can do with source generators and have that all done for you. So did I did I just make,
well, I'm still trying to parse what I saw here.
Sorry.
I think we need a source generator to help us.
Complicated, so.
No, that's beautiful. I love it. That's awesome.
I think we need a cleanup crew in aisle 2. Brain matter everywhere.
brain matter.
The intent is, from this perspective, me using the libraries should be simple. Like, I just suddenly have a map to destination method. I have a partially apply. I have rock dot methods where I can set up expectations on those methods and properties. What the generated code does is kind of immaterial to me. I just want it to work, but it empowers you. It makes it able for you to automate stuff and give better APIs and make things easier to understand. And that's what you want to see as the end result. Is me as a developer, this is what I want, is just stuff created for me to make my life easier.
Mm-hmm. So do you
more serious question here? Can we call the package box instead of box? Well played.
I was trying to be creative when it was Rosalind plus Mox, so I came up with rocks, and then I had somebody create actual icons with me that have that. If you look at the package, there's a asteroids looking 80s type of logo to this package. It's the only one I've ever customized, but yeah, I don't want to change it to box, even though that's quite clever. I'd rather just keep it this way right now. So
there's a Dr. Seuss joke in there somewhere, but I can't even begin to find it.
I hope that for people that are seeing this, if it does seem a little involved, I don't want to dismiss that, because actually creating the source generators requires you to understand, to some degree, not necessarily compilers, but at least the syntax trees, semantic models, what the compiler API is actually giving you. And that's not trivial. That's not as simple as saying create a method that adds 2 integers together. It gets quite involved. But if you're willing to go down that path, you get a ton of power and extensibility at your fingertips and be able to do a lot of cool stuff.
So let's say that I am a masochist. No, so where do I start? So I mean, you've laid out some great demos here, but I'm still having a hard time saying, okay, how can I? Where do I put this? How do I apply this into my projects to save me time and effort? Right. Even though you've shown me some great demos, I right now I'm still picturing them kind of being kind of ivory tower demos, right? Kind of like, okay, here's this curated example. Do you have like a project where, I mean, obviously your mapper, I think that's, you made package that as a NuGet package and some other stuff, but do you have like a project where you're like, this is the, what am I looking for? The archetypical application of this technology?
Yeah, well, I don't, but in those links that I provided in the guest, I don't even know what to say anymore. I'm so like, I'm saying it right, but in that list of URLs, there are links to a whole bunch of samples, and the ones that come from Microsoft, there are a couple of, I don't want to say simplistic, but they're relatively straightforward. The one that shows you how to implement, like if you want to implement iNotify property change, it gives you a demo on how to do that. And all the other examples that are out there, what I would say though to answer that question is a couple of things. One is, if you want to see where would I use this in my code? If you're doing something where you're using reflection, for example, that's one spot. It doesn't mean you're going to replace it, but that to me is an indicator that you can look at that and go, maybe instead of it being reflection, I can have it generate code, and then I get a performance increase. I don't have to run that reflection code. So that's one that I would look for. Or if there's just something where I know that in our code, we always want to do X, whatever X is. So I always have to write out these 10 lines of code. Write a source generator so that if you can, so that it will do that for you. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I do want to plug, there are a couple of things that you have in your calendar for this show that I think people should watch if they want to see other examples. One of them you have Yair, I apologize if I say his name wrong, Yair Halberstad. He's going to do a talk on strong inject, which is using source generators for dependency injection. That's going to be really, really cool. That's in March 8th. And then Mika Dumont, I think her name is, she talks about Roslyn analyzers, but that's got a strong correlation to this because that also uses syntax trees and syntax generators and syntax factories and all that other stuff. So that's probably another one to watch in the future as well. So that, there is no easy way to get into this just because of that compiler API component, but you can overcome it. You can learn about it and spend some time getting your head around it. And the more you dig in, the more you're going to be able to do. And it's a lot, to me, it's a lot of fun.
Like one of the things I thought of right away is like some of the ORMs that exist, like entity frameworks kind of, you can do like where you have your SQL tables defined, or you can do code first. But is there an opportunity for something like that where you have tables or some sort of shape of an object, and then you could use source generators to generate those objects for you?
That, or you could do potentially something like, I know at this spot in code, it's going to need to generate the SQL to run this query. And this is just completely off the top of my head. Maybe you could have a source generator that actually goes off and says, I know you're going to hit this code, so I'm going to actually generate the SQL so it doesn't happen at runtime. It'll be happening at compile time. That might be a bad idea, I'm not sure, but that's something that you can do. There's also an example that somebody has from, I think it's in the Microsoft examples, where you can actually have an additional file as a CSV file. And then they create a type safe wrapper around the CSV file with integers and strings for all the columns and rows that they see in the CSV file. That's really, really cool too.
That's pretty compelling. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. I'm thinking of David's question. This gets me thinking back to when database first and EDMX files were a thing, and Entity Framework 6, they would actually use T4 files, the .tt file extensions to generate the models. It feels like source generators could have been a possible use case.
Definitely possible. I mean, again, anything where you're doing any type of code generation as well, where you're using T4, that it's definitely possible to take that and now do it as a source generator. You'll have to obviously use a whole different approach. You can't use T4, but at least you can now have that same thing done as a source generator.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to look more into this. My wheels keep turning here. I keep trying to think of different ways to apply this in real world scenarios. And you had mentioned reflection, and I'm kind of curious about that because I wrote a library that does a bit of reflection, and I'm trying to figure out how I would replace that with source generators.
Well, so back here, so you still have the screen shared, I'm not sure, but if you do,
yep.
I did create, and I want to be really clear. I only did this just because I was curious. What would this inline mapper, does it have any performance benefit over reflection or AutoMapper? And really, I'm not trying to get into a war over AutoMapper. That's not the point. The point is I just was curious because AutoMapper has a lot of tuning, has a lot of stuff in there, but it's still, if you look at AutoMapper down here, this map to destination or map to, it still has to do something, at least at one point, to figure out, well, what are the source and destination properties? And maybe it creates an expression tree. I'm not sure what it does underneath the scenes. And then it compiles that expression tree. Sure. If I was purely doing this as reflection here, this is kind of a reflection way of mapping source to destination. And I looked at all three of them, and I was like, well, not like your question is, well, how do I take that and put it into source generators? You do have to change your mindset and not you, because it's not the same APIs, but it's the same kind of approach. I'm going to find like a class declaration syntax, or if I'm at the semantic model, I'm going to find an I type symbol that represents that type that I'm looking at. Okay, so there is somewhat of an analogy, but the cool thing is if you actually go down that route, I use benchmark.net to compare all three of these. And again, this is not a comprehensive benchmark, but if you are using reflection, when I do it in line, I get 3 orders of magnitude speed and about 2 orders of magnitude less memory allocated.
Wow.
And then AutoMapper is really good. It's still fast, but being able to actually generate that code and have it compiled so it doesn't have to do that at runtime, it makes it even that much faster. And that's
Right.
something that AutoMapper, the people that create and maintain AutoMapper, they could do that as well. They could potentially look at what they have and say, well, let's maybe use source generators and have that all generated as well. So
we've got a couple of minutes remaining, and then we're going to bring the ASP.NET community stand up to all of you lovely folks out there. Hopefully you stick around for that. But are there any closing thoughts you'd like to leave the viewers with, Jason? Maybe getting started resources or lessons you've learned along the way?
The resources, I've provided that, and I highly recommend people take a look at those to dive deeper. There's a lot of stuff that's being built by the community. In fact, I think I heard from Jared Pearson. He's one of the folks on the C# team, that source generators is been a lot more popular. They knew people wanted to use it, but it's a lot more popular than what they expected. There's a lot of work being done with this stuff. So there's a lot of examples out there to take a look at. The debugging and testing part is a little suspect, as I mentioned before, but you can get around it. That definitely works. And yeah, I highly recommend people to take a look at all this stuff that's related to the compiler API. You on a day-to-day experience, you may not be, you're creating APIs, you're creating repositories, you're talking to databases, but if you take the time to learn this stuff as well, you have the potential to do a whole bunch of things and automate and make faster with source generators. You have that ability then to do it. So highly recommend people take a deeper dive and look into this stuff.
Awesome. This has been great.
Cool.
Is there any other questions we should address here? Someone had asked, what's the future of T4? I don't know if we have the answer for that or not.
That would be a great question for one of the engineering repos. If you opened an issue in the .NET GitHub repo, someone there would have the answer. And just so you have it, David, is that the .NET/core repo, or has that name changed?
I believe it's just the runtime.
Runtime?
So .NET/runtime.
Got it. Cool. Well, thank you again, Jason, for joining us today. Hopefully folks enjoyed this episode and learned something new from it. Who do we have next week?
Looks like we're going to have Brandon Minnick on next week.
Awesome. So Brandon is one of our cloud advocates. Looks like he'll be joined by, is it an MVP?
Awesome. Yeah, I think so. I'm looking forward to that one. As always, thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure. Hopefully Twin Cities Code Camp, is that happening this year or no?
We're still looking. It all depends on vaccinations and safety and everything else. But we're usually on an April, cadence. We might do one in October. We don't know yet. There's no promise. Okay. But yeah, hopefully. I want to do these again.
Me too. Awesome. Well, thanks again for the show. Much appreciated, and see you friends next week.
Stay tuned for the community stand-up.